Welcome to episode 57 of the FoodGrads Podcast, the podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica Hislop, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with FoodGrads. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Ran Goel, CEO of Fresh City. Fresh City is an award-winning urban farm and omni-channel retailer. Founder-led, they are on a mission to provide better life through food. They deliver organic produce, chef-inspired, and made-from-scratch prepared foods, and thousands of more items to families in the Greater Toronto Area. They also farm in Downsview Park, where they operate a farmer incubator program. On this episode, Ran and I talked about how he started Fresh City in 2011 after leaving his job as a Wall Street lawyer to help change the way people think about and shop for food. We also talked about what he does as a CEO, why he believes that home delivery is the way to help fight climate change, urban agriculture, and his approach to change. We also talked a little bit more about what his advice is to young people thinking about going into this grocery space in urban agriculture. So if you are looking for a positive push that makes you feel that you can actually make a change in this current climate situation that we're in, then you need to give this episode a listen. So enough of that introduction. Let's get on with the show. Okay, I'm excited to have another guest on our podcast today, and I've actually had the pleasure of hearing said person speak a few years ago at the Toronto Food Film Festival, I believe it was. It feels like so long ago, and just hearing about urban agriculture, and it was a really inspiring talk, and I'm so happy to be able to have Ran on the show, so thank you for coming here.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. And I think you'll be able to do it better than I can with an introduction. So would you be able to tell me more about what you do and Farm City Farms? Or pardon me, Farm City Fresh. Oh my gosh.
Fresh City.
Great way to start the conversation. You do it better than me. I'll let you take the wing.
So my name is Ran. I'm the CEO, founder of Fresh City, which is a company that is based here in Toronto. We're an urban farm, and we operate 3 other businesses: Mama Earth Organics, which does online organic delivery, Mabel's Bakery, and a Healthy Butcher. And we've been around for about 11 years now.
Wow, that is very impressive. And they're definitely big, like if you're into the specialty like grocery stores or even just looking for alternative ways of getting produce and that, like those places come up like instantly, and it's really cool what you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been quite the journey, but I think at the heart of it is this idea that we can eat better for ourselves and our communities and our planet.
I know that you have a very unique story in terms of how this all came to be, and you did not you did not grow up on a farm and then decide to continue on that tradition. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about how it came to be?
Sure. So I practiced law for several years on Wall Street. So I kind of went to school here in Toronto and then decided to go to New York to practice law, because I really wanted to live in New York and I needed to pay off my law school debts. And so that's what I did. So I practiced there during the financial crisis of 2008 onwards. And at the time, I kind of had this sense that I wanted to do something with a higher meaning, with a higher calling, if you will. And I started thinking about different businesses that I could start that were so-called triple bottom line, which means people, profit, planet. So you're not just looking to make a profit, but looking to have other beneficial impacts. And as I was noodling about what I would do with my next chapter, I started reading about food. So my gateway into food was Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, which many of your listeners might be familiar with. And it was really the first thing I read that connected some of these dots, because until then I was, like all of us human types, an eater. So I did eat every day, but I didn't really think of it as an environmental act or a political act or a social act. I just thought of it as just something you need to do. And I knew there was some foods that were healthier than others, but I never really thought about all the implications of every bite that I was putting in my mouth. And that book really set me off on a bit of a journey to learn about where our food comes from, how it's produced. And what I learned simultaneously shocked me and gave me hope. Shocked in the sense that I realized that certainly the way I was eating, from not eating food that was local or organic or fair trade, had huge implications on other people around the world and on our lived environment. And so you just start reading about all the impacts our food system's having on the world, and it can be pretty depressing. But on the other hand, it also gave me hope because I thought that here is something that is imminently solvable. So the cool thing about quote unquote solving our food issues or all the various issues afflicting our food system is that none of them really require too much sacrifice and none of them really require any kind of technological breakthrough. So it kind of gave me hope that a lot of these issues could be solved. And so I just started thinking about it insofar as I was going to start a social enterprise or a values based business. I wanted it to be in food. And I became obsessed with this idea that urban farming was an important way to really get people thinking about food. And I think it goes to the heart of what I think is the issue with our food system as it is. I think there isn't ultimately enough intention or consciousness on behalf of each of us, and I include myself, and certainly on behalf of our leaders, our political leaders and other leaders, about how our food system looks like. And I thought urban farming was a great way to connect most of the population today who lives in Canada, at least, that lives in urban areas, reconnecting them with food, the realities of food production, the joys of it, how hard it can be, the impacts it has on the environment. So I just became really enamored with this idea of creating viable urban farms in urban areas to connect people with food. And the rest is history. Here we are in our 12th growing season here in Toronto.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's funny that you say about it's funny that urban agriculture isn't maybe larger considering that we're on a country that is a huge exporter of food and all that, but yet so many are very disconnected to the food that we produce, which is very strange given the like where we live, especially GTA has some of the best like land and like fertilizer and all that type of stuff to keep going. So it's just I really have to point out that you use the word consciousness because even as someone for me, I can even struggle with thinking about intentionally with food because when you get in your routines of life, even though you think about food a lot, you might not necessarily think about it as intentionally as you would like to. So it's really good that you have been able to help create some solutions to that. And we've talked about urban agriculture, and maybe the word explains what it is, but would you be able to just dive a little bit deeper into that and how is Fresh City Farms actually implementing this urban agriculture?
It's a great question. And I will say, starting from your first point about intentionality and consciousness, I think the critical thing, the message I'd want to definitely send to anybody listening to this is it's ultimately not about feeling guilty or feeling bad about what food you're eating.
I really appreciate your approach to being hopeful because I think that guilt is for many people like me, guilt is the thing that comes first and foremost. And you don't want to be that, but it is difficult. And sometimes people don't have the choice to
Exactly.
choose intentionally. And there's a lot of messaging that they should feel guilty about that. And I appreciate you saying about being hopeful in that. So I'll let you continue.
No, 100%. Like, grew up certainly not poor, but not wealthy by any stretch, lower middle class or whatever you'd want to classify it as. But I know the reality of what it's like to have a very limited food budget and trying to make it happen for a family of five, in our case, growing up. So zero guilt. It's just a question of how do we get ourselves to a better place as individuals and as a community in terms of how we eat. In terms of urban farming, it's really interesting. We've, as I said, farmed for 12 growing seasons now. And really, in a way, the role of urban farming, at least in my own mind, has evolved a bit. So it's not so much about trying to grow as much food as possible in the city. It's less about, obviously, there's less food kilometers associated with food grown in the city. But even though that's an important benefit, it's not the most important benefit. The way we do it is, so we have about 11 acres at Downsview Park that we farm. So Downsview Park, for those of you not familiar, it's a geographic epicenter of Toronto in North York, in an old military base that's been converted into urban farm. And what we do there is we actually only, as a company, only farm about a quarter of that land. So we've created this farm with what I call a co-farming vision. And so the rest of the land, about 3/4 of it, is divided up between 6 other farmers that we've partnered with, 6 other urban farmers. each of them that we selected through a kind of a call for proposal with an equity and justice lens, either nonprofits or companies that were really trying to serve their community and really further the cause of food justice. So, for example, we have the YMCA that runs a farm camp there. We have a couple of farms that grow for profit but sell only within that community or primarily within that community. We have one that focuses on education and teaching people how to grow. So really, I kind of see it as a bit of a platform for consciousness raising. So we try to create a farm that grows in a very serious way. So this is not some kind of little token
No.
raised bed or anything like that. It's a fully functioning commercial farm. But overlaid on that is really an air of a posture of being very welcoming to people in various stages of their journey. So for example, we have an events hall, like a barn, where we host corporate retreats and things like that. So really trying to create this place where people can interact with food and farming and slowly connect the dots in a way that's meaningful for them. So the overall idea is to really get people thinking about food, but not being very prescriptive about their journey and how that should look like.
I love that. And there's so many different avenues about how they can get involved with the food, because I think that even just at the basis of just having community activities, I think is great, because I'm very much an advocate and believing of local city communities, and just doing these types of things are just good for strengthening just overall morale, but even just bringing more awareness to understanding about food, because again, the education, we don't get a lot of time to learn in school about how foods are properly grown. And I just think that being able to do something, I don't want to say productive, but at the same time, like, so many different things are being touched upon in just this one aspect. And it's really cool that how you're just going about it.
Yeah, I think a part of what we're trying to accomplish ultimately is, if you think about what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years, I think there's been a lot more attention paid to food through books like Michael Pollan's and various documentaries. And I think the media has become much better at covering food stories and sustainability and food justice issues. But what you really need is to connect the kind of the eaters or potential eaters for this kind of food with the makers, like farmers. So you need to be able to continue to nourish that farming and maker community to help them grow and scale, continue to help grow the audience for this kind of food. And in between have these kind of connectors. So like whether it's retailers or distributors that are getting the food from the farm to somebody's table. And that's what kind of we try to do as a whole. So we've really evolved beyond just being an urban farm to our core business today in terms of revenue is delivery, online delivery. And it's really a way to try to get the food that we make, both at our farm, but also in our kitchen, in our bakery, in our butchery, to consumers. Really try to create an alternative food system, if you will, where we're nurturing this network of sustainable minded farmers and suppliers and connecting them with consumers who are starting to connect the dots, but don't always have an easy way to access that kind of food in their day to day.
And there's two places that, as you say, that I could think about taking this conversation. I'm going to veer into the way of, first of all, just talking about your TEDx talk or TEDx Toronto talk that you did, talking about many of the things that we've already been discussing. So if you're listening, I do recommend checking that out, and I'll make sure to link that in the notes. But one of the things that had stood out while you had done your talk was that you talked about how, as Canadians, we spend about 8% on our food, while there's places like Japan that spend like 50%. I think that's the value that you used. And I was curious about, like, just talking more about these values and such. And do you think that the reason why there's such a disparity in terms of how much we spend on our food is more maybe related to the diversity in our diets in Canada, or is there some other factors that go into play?
In terms of from a comparative perspective, I think there's a whole bunch of things. So some of it's due to geography. So for example, a place like Iceland or Japan needs to import a lot of their food because they're smaller relative to their population. So that's part of the driver. But I think another kind of big part of it is the labor structure, really, of each country. And by that, in many countries, you have much more robust labor protections and higher minimum wages, much more kind of rigid regulations around laying people off, et cetera. And that overall increases the cost of labor, which then translates into higher food prices because of processors, farmers, and retailers have to pay labor more. So that's one big driver of it. And frankly, that's one of one of the things I think we don't really appreciate here in Canada, that a lot of the food that we buy is made by probably some of the most vulnerable workers in the world, ultimately, which is farm
Wow.
workers working in Florida and California and Mexico and all these other countries where their labor rights aren't really respected, and certainly the enforcement is pretty lax. So I think the labor part of it is a big part of it.
Okay, that would make sense in terms of just I do know about the different structures in that, and I am aware. And coming back to that idea of let's like maybe bring it to the listener and such, without the idea of maybe guilt, maybe people want to be more advocating for this industry or they want to make this system better. What small steps would you suggest that maybe because our audience is primarily students, young adults, like what would you suggest would be some great ways to help change the system without feeling the guilt?
Yeah, so I think my overall message would be just enter the arena and do something. And and don't beat yourself up about not being able to do everything ultimately. And so I'll speak a bit about that. Certainly some more obvious and accessible ways you could do it is, shop at a place like Fresh City, obviously very self-serving statement, but I think there's retailers who do try to support local, do try to support more sustainable ways of farming and production. And it's important to support that so that they can support the makers behind it. Things like going to your local farmers market, growing food yourself, I think are all really important. That said, I do think sometimes there is too much of a focus on what I can do myself versus the impact I can have on my broader community. And by that, I think at its core, it's wrestling with power structures to change how food is produced, distributed, and sold. And so that can mean everything from, if you're a university student, asking who has the contracts for various food service outlets in your university or your college, and do they have any regard at all for things like where they source their food from, how do they deal with food waste, all sorts of issues that kind of are important to our food system. It could mean, who are you casting a ballot for in a municipal, provincial, or federal election? What's their stance, if any, on food? And if you work at a company, where is your company sourcing food from when they bring in catering? So I think each of us can do a lot. And I think the key thing is not to get into kind of black and white thinking about you either have to do it all or do nothing, or that you need to feel guilty about what you're eating or what you're putting in your mouth. I think the key is just to do something, to be honest with you. And then maybe that step turns into 3 more steps, a year or 2, or maybe it doesn't, but at least you've moved the ball forward on some issue.
That's really good. And I love the idea of bringing it into community. And I think it's a smart place to start with your university, start with your college, because it's very good chance you'll be able to find like-minded individuals like other students that would want to come together and bring up these issues. So it could be a good way to help your university experience not only bond, but also make small changes and not feel like you're alone. Because I think a lot of times it you can it can be like you said, it's an all or nothing. So you think that you have to change the whole system, and then that could just instantly lose your motivation. So maybe just starting small, or just even knowing there's others with you, that can build that momentum. Because obviously, seeing what you've done, you started in the grand scheme of things not that long ago, but there's been so much positive change that you and all those that individuals you're working with have been able to do.
Yeah, exactly. And the reality of it is you don't really know where it all ends. And so I think in life you act and you're trying your best to act on your values, and you don't know. I don't know ultimately where our story ends, or I don't know any given step we're trying to take to move things forward where it's going to end. But I certainly know that nothing will change unless you try. And that's what I come back to, is you have to drop your cynicism a bit, be hopeful, and just try something.
That's a really good point. And I'm going to take it over to something that also is an important issue. Was we haven't talked about climate change in that. And one of the article pieces that I'd read was that you believe that home delivery, it was a big change. And I'll be honest, like I had never done home delivery prior to the pandemic, but I was sick one day with COVID, and that was the first time that my family needed it. And it's been awesome. I won't lie, home deliveries like awesome for groceries. And yeah, so you have talked about how it can help fight climate change. So let's talk about this, because that is a very important issue right now.
Yeah, 100%. So it's really interesting. So I think what home delivery can do at its best is that it effectively centralizes demand in much fewer places than how many grocery stores you need. So, for example, you could from one warehouse probably deliver to the same amount of customers that would shop at, say, 10 grocery stores. And what the benefit of that is that you have much less food waste because whenever you aggregate demand, it's not a question of trying to calculate how many say berries each of these store needs, and you have it just in one warehouse so that even if in a typical store you do your best to try to forecast what demand will be, but you don't really know, so you might have a lot of waste that ends up from that. So I'd say one actually underappreciated aspect of home delivery is that it can be centralized. Certainly for us it's very centralized, and that means you can centralize demand and have much less food waste as a result. So that's number one. Number two, home delivery. So for example, for at Fresh City and Mama Earth, we deliver up to 50 or 60 deliveries with one vehicle, which is much more carbon efficient than 50 or 60 households each driving, often in an SUV or a pickup, 2 or 3 kilometers to their closest grocery store and 2 or 3 kilometers back. So it's much more carbon efficient because it's a very dense routes that we create and make sure they're as efficient as possible. So that's the second thing where the greenhouse gas emission footprint is much lower from delivery versus if you were to go to shop. And the third thing that I think people don't appreciate as much either is that there is a lot of refrigeration and open refrigeration in particular in grocery stores because of what we have trained the customer to expect, so to speak. So if you'll walk into a big grocery store, you'll see all these beautiful open fridges with your spinach and, all these
Yeah.
beautifully curated things. And it's very beautiful, these walls, but at the same time, it's just open and it means a lot more energy needs to be used for that. And that's the other part that home delivery does away with altogether is it doesn't need to be sitting there displayed for the customer. It can sit in big walk-in fridges, which are way more energy efficient, and you can deliver from there.
Oh, that is I've never once thought about that aspect because I know from a food safety perspective, I know that a lot of food safety people don't quite like these also open refrigerators as well because open and close, and there's more of a chance of things maybe being out of the temperature it's supposed to be. But from an energy standpoint, it's just like something that I had never considered. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at countries where energy is more expensive than here, so in Europe primarily, you'll see there's way less open refrigeration in Europe. There's a lot more glass doors on almost everything you buy there compared to here.
Wow. And see, I think that opens up the idea of just exposure because lived in Canada, I've really never gone anywhere else except the United States. So that is my only concept of what a grocery store can be or like what it is. So hearing that there's different countries that go about it and take into consideration these factors. But yes, home delivery has really, I was a little bit of a snob to it to begin with. I'll be perfectly honest. But after I did it once, I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And also as well, like
Awesome.
for me, I found that when I did do the home delivery, I was a lot more deliberate about what I was choosing in terms of there was less food waste I found because I wasn't guessing what I had at home. I would just go downstairs and go look, and I wouldn't purchase more than I needed. So
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a whole bunch of, we talked about the environmental climate aspects of it, but I think on a consumer level, for sure, there's less impulse buying when you're online. So I think when you're planning your meal for tomorrow or the day after, you're planning a good meal. Like you're the best version of you, as opposed to the version of you that's really hungry and then orders Uber Eats or as the grocery store and picks up that chocolate.
yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with chocolate, so I don't want to shame anybody.
No,
I
no,
love
no.
chocolate and I eat a lot of it. So I think that's the one thing. And the other part is time savings as well. So for some people, I think grocery shopping is a chore, like they don't love to do it and they're time strapped. So it's a way to unlock a bit of time as well. So
For
there are other
sure.
benefits.
For sure, there's so many of them. And we haven't actually talked more about what Fresh City Farms actually carries because we've talked about these issues. But one of the things that's pretty awesome with what you do is you just get exposed to a lot of local creators, a lot of entrepreneurs, but just good produce from local farms and that. So that's a win there. So working there, like what has been some of your favorite products or what can we expect if we went and purchased from you?
For sure, yeah. So through Fresh City and Mama Earth, we sell. I think the two kind of broad categories I'm the most proud of and I get most excited about is first and foremost produce, of course. So certainly, especially this time of year in the heart of the Ontario growing season, we sell stuff that you can't get anywhere else. Amazing heirloom tomatoes and garlic scapes, which most people haven't had, which are essentially what grows out of the garlic before you harvest it. So usually it's just thrown away, but it's a bit of a hybrid between a spring onion and garlic in terms of the taste and the texture. It is selling things like rhubarb and a whole bunch of greens that you wouldn't be able to buy at a typical grocery store. So the produce I get really excited about, and of course it's all local, almost all local this time of year. So very fresh and very nutritious. So I'd have to say first and foremost produce, and then the second kind of big category is what we've really dedicated a lot of the last few years to doing better and better is in-house made goods products. So we have lots of breads and pastries under the Mabel's brand, again, made with local ingredients. All the kitchen products we make under the Fresh City brand, which is different in terms of being locally organically sourced, which is very rare for prepared foods. So you can't really go to a restaurant or a grocery store and buy an organic meal or salad.
Hmm.
Typically, you have to produce it yourself. So it's very well sourced, and also most of it comes in reusable packaging. Sell a lot of our prepared foods in jars that people then return for the next delivery. So they leave them out, then we deliver their next one and take the empties. So I'm really proud of that because I think as we've migrated to a very convenience focused culture, we're creating a lot of plastic waste as a
For
result.
sure.
And that's one of the things that we're really trying to nip in the bud and change as much as we can. So I'd say that's the two kind of things I'm very proud about because it's really showcases all of the amazing suppliers and farmers in here in Southern Ontario. And B, I think it shows that you don't necessarily need to sacrifice taste, quality, convenience in eating better ultimately.
Those are all very good points because at the end of the day, that sometimes is just what we ended up choosing is convenience. And it's not that we necessarily want to, but it's just life gets busy. We have a lot of obligations and such. So knowing that there is options that can help minimize what we're doing, that's really great to know. And I'm definitely gonna have to check it out more for sure. And one of the things I also had wanted to talk about and just get the chance to ask you is just talking about just the general grocery and retail space and just career development, because a lot of our listeners, again, are younger people. And I wanted to know, do you think that there's opportunities for students or maybe young people to maybe progress their careers in this industry? Is there, if they started in Fresh City Farms, would there be opportunities to grow and move around?
I certainly think so. There's a lot of changes happening right now in the food world. In the retail landscape, you're seeing these big tectonic shifts towards convenience and towards more sustainability and authenticity. And I think that's going to unlock a lot of opportunities in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I think personally, food's a very exciting place to be right now. And certainly we see in a place like Fresh City, we have been beneficiaries of these trends as people are looking to make it easier on themselves to get their groceries or look for ways to eat more healthier and more sustainably. So I would say 100%. I will say I think any student entering the labor market, whether it's in food or in any other vertical, I think the pace of change is only accelerating. I always sort of tell people it's not a question of you're going to sign up to this career that you're going to then do for the next 30 or 40 years. Frankly, none of us have an idea of exactly how the industry is going to evolve. But as long as you're committed to excellence, committed to improving your skill set and are hungry, so to speak, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the food world.
You say developing your skill set. As someone who works in a position like you, what would you suggest are some of the things that someone might want to focus on and grow?
I think something that people I think don't appreciate as much right now is that there's a huge leadership vacuum, I think, in food. And that it's everything from needing new entrepreneurs who are willing to push the boundaries to people who are good at managing people and motivating them, especially this new younger generation that's looking for more meaning from their work. They're looking for work-life balance. I do think it takes a special kind of leader and leaders with a servant leadership kind of mentality rather than the kind of traditional hierarchical model that in previous generations was what you saw up and down the food value chain, whether it's in restaurant kitchens or at grocery stores or at farms. So I think the leadership aspects of it, so the ability to motivate a team, mentor a team towards a given goal, I think is something that people don't appreciate how flexible of a skill set that is and how much it's a bit of a Swiss Army knife, meaning that kind of almost no matter what context, where you end up in the food system or even outside the food system, how that skill set is very valued by organizations.
That's actually interesting. And did you find you're in a very much a leadership role? Did you find that it was something that came naturally to you, or was there anything that you had to really particularly like work on to really build up to be able to do that?
Yeah, for me personally, there's a part of it that I think came naturally. I love people. I love connecting with people. I really believe in what we're doing. And I think that shows it's very authentic, the why of what we do. I think the parts that I've had to be much more intentional about is as we've gotten bigger to realize that you need systems around these intentions, because I think at a certain scale, systems are much less important than they are as you grow. So everything from initially, for the first few years of the business, we never really had an onboarding program for staff because it was a small enough team that you had like informal mentorship that kind of occurred naturally and everyone was on the same page. But as you get bigger, you need to create some of these systems that make sure that everyone gets a good onboarding experience, gets, for example, reviews on a regular basis, gets proactive feedback on their performance. So I think for me, it was a question of being used to like a smaller team and being able to keep tabs on what the morale was and what people were feeling, to a place where you really need to create systems. And I think that's been part of my kind of leadership evolution, is trying to become a better leader in that sense, realizing that I can't be everywhere at the same time.
I like that because I think that is something that when you're in the thick of it, you might not necessarily think about, step back, look at the systems in that, because you get so caught up in growing, going from small to large, that sometimes you just don't realize like the inefficiencies. So it's nice. It's interesting to hear you talk about systems, because I actually do feel that's a lot of the language a lot of younger people say. A lot of systems aren't working right now. And like, how do we change the system? So it's an important aspect for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
But I also just like you talking about leadership, because as well, like when we're young, we always say I feel like we're always told when you're putting your resume to be able to say that you're a leader, show demonstrations of it, but it's not necessarily, it's hard to define what a leader is, because I think that many people might go about it differently, and how you be a leader in one team might be different to how you show leadership in another way. So building that skill set, especially when you're young, and just it would be good to have a lot of opportunities to do volunteering in that, to really develop that and just understand what it means to be a leader. And it doesn't necessarily mean telling people what to do, but just understanding people.
Exactly.
So with that being said as well, maybe we've already answered that question, but I always like to ask guests who come on the show, what piece of advice would you give to young people looking to go into a role or the industries to what you're doing right now? Or we can just go with general life advice. That always works as
I
well.
think it's interesting. So I will say it's a bit of a tough question for me to answer vis-a-vis Fresh City, in the sense we do a lot of different things. So for example, we farm, we bake, we butcher, we cook, we deliver. We're software developers because we have an e-commerce front end. We're marketers. We're logistics providers. So there's a lot of different things. So it's a bit, I guess I'm trying to find a unifying thread that connects a lot of what we do ultimately, because it's all in the service of food, obviously. But I think that the biggest thing I would say is have a willingness to learn and be present wherever you're at. And by that, I mean, I do think there's a tendency, especially in the food world, for people to think of some of these positions as temporary, which is in many cases true. So for example, you have a student who just wants to work for the part-time during the year, or you have somebody who just has 20 hours a week. They want to drive a bit to make some extra money. And that's completely fine. Like, I don't think every person at Fresh City is necessarily, wanting to be there for the next 5 years. That said, I think the mistake a lot of people make is not really being present and being all in in their jobs, meaning that they're not really taking advantage of the opportunities to learn and to develop as a person, first and foremost, in those jobs. So I think that that's the key thing is like, no matter where you find yourself, even if it's not where you wanted to find yourself or you want to graduate to something better. I think, being able to come to work every day, show up, learn as much as you can, try to develop those people skills, those leadership skills, I think is very critical. And I think a lot of people kind of lose whole chunks of their life. And I don't mean just for Fresh City, if they're in a job where they're not necessarily passionate about it or they want to do something else and forget that they still can learn a lot from almost every other context that they're in.
That's really good advice. And I know personally for me is sometimes like you're already trying to get to the next role. And sometimes you also lose just the enjoyment of what life is. If you're trying to think about what your next step is, you're not present in there. And then you end up being done the role and you just think, oh God, what did I do? Like you just miss like enjoyment of your life. Every life has like different stages in that. And you don't realize what can help you because some of the roles that I've done in the past, I think back and think like at the time, I didn't really think much of what I was doing in the day to day, but realizing it now, I'm like, wow, that was actually really helping me grow, or that was really helping me think about things in a different way. And I wouldn't be the person I am today. So just having more intention with what you're doing now not only can just help you in the long run, but just enjoy life in general. Because I think we try to rush through it way too fast. Get through high school, get into the college or university one, or get into that next job, get into that next role. And it's always the next. But like, when are you going to actually take the time to just enjoy and learn and just have that opportunity for something? Because it can become more if you really just enjoy it.
No, exactly. Now I think back, I used to flip burgers at Canada's Wonderland in my high school years. And at the time, I didn't really aspire to anything more. In other words, I could have become a supervisor potentially and then go out from there. But I just thought, I'm just here to flip burgers, and for an extra 25 cents an hour, I'm not going to be a supervisor and deal with all that. But I think it was a big missed opportunity because especially from where I am today, I think it would have actually helped me progress as a leader much more at that time and probably translated into more skills even in my work at Fresh City. So I just think there's just a lot of context in which and again, I include myself in this, sometimes just check out rather than really taking advantage of the opportunity that's there, even though if it's not something we aspire to in the long term.
It's true because as well, you don't know where your life's going to take you in that. And sometimes it just doesn't seem like as you said, like working a summer job and all that, it might not seem like what's really the point. Like I'm not going to be here for very long. I don't see how this could help me in the long run. It's just going to cause more headaches than what it's worth. Being intentional also means that thinking about it could be your next opportunity in a way that you just never imagined. So don't limit yourself. You just never know where life can take you.
Exactly. Well said.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm going to end our conversation there because we've talked about so many great issues, and I really enjoy your approach to how you're coming about things, because I'm going to go back to that again. It's just the idea of not always being guilty about a lot of things. It's something that I struggle with a lot. So it's probably the thing that stood out to me the most, and just that there's so many opportunities to make a better system in that. And I really appreciate your approach also being optimistic and more hopeful, because I think we need more about that. There's a lot of doom and gloom about a lot of the things, but I think that you're bringing some light to say, hey, we can change it. It's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen if we just be intentional with that and grow ourselves and grow our communities. And so many things are connected. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Ran. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks for having me, Veronica. It's been awesome. Thanks for all the great questions.